There is a question that has haunted historians for over a century, and no one, not the archaeologists, not the linguists, not the climate scientists, has been able to answer it completely. In the span of roughly 50 years, at a time when the ancient world was more connected, more prosperous, and more sophisticated than it had ever been, almost every major civilization around the Eastern Mediterranean simply stopped. Their palaces burned, their cities emptied, their writing systems disappeared. And to this day, we are still not entirely sure why. Stay with us until the end tonight, because the answer, or rather, the many possible answers, may be more complex and quietly surprising than you expect. Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Science Guide. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day it has been, you can let it go. Set it aside gently, the way you might put down something you have been carrying for too long. There is nothing you need to do right now, nowhere you need to be, nothing that cannot wait until morning. Let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, let the room around you grow soft and distant. Tonight we are going to travel a very long way back in time, to a world that once glittered with gold and bronze and trade ships crossing a blue sea, and then, quietly, fell silent. If these slow journeys through history and science help you unwind at the end of your day, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And if you feel like it, leave a comment before you drift off. Just tell us which country you are listening from tonight. Now, let us begin. Imagine the Mediterranean Sea on a warm afternoon, sometime around the year 1250 before the Common Era. The water is the deep blue that has no equivalent in any other part of the world, and on that water there are ships, not small fishing boats hugging the coastline, but large, deep-bellied merchant vessels loaded below the waterline with copper and tin and cedar wood and lapis lazuli and glass and ivory and grain. They move slowly, these ships, pushed by seasonal winds along routes that have been traveled for generations, stopping at the ports of Cyprus and the Levantine coast and the islands of the Aegean, offloading cargo and taking on new goods, connecting one civilization to another in a web of exchange that would not be seen again in the Mediterranean world for more than 1,000 years. This was the Late Bronze Age, and it was, in almost every meaningful sense, one of the earliest and most interconnected worlds humanity had ever built. The civilizations that ringed the Eastern Mediterranean in this period were not primitive. They were not simple. They had palace economies of remarkable complexity, run by scribes and administrators who kept detailed records on clay tablets. They had diplomatic systems, treaty obligations, trade agreements, royal marriages negotiated across hundreds of miles of open water. Their kings wrote letters to one another in a shared diplomatic language, addressed each other as brothers, sent gifts of gold and horses and perfumed oils to maintain the bonds of alliance. Their merchants traveled from Egypt to Anatolia to the Aegean to the Levant, carrying goods that had originated in places as distant as Afghanistan and sub-Saharan Africa. And all of this, the ships, the letters, the palaces, the scribes, the caravans of copper ingots moving overland through Anatolia, functioned together as a single interlocking system. And then, within the space of about 50 years, it stopped. That is not a metaphor. That is not a simplification. Between roughly 1200 and 1150 before the Common Era, the Hittite Empire, which had ruled most of Anatolia for centuries, and fought Egypt to a standstill, disappeared entirely. The Mycenaean palace civilization of Greece, which had produced the warrior culture that Homer would later immortalize, collapsed so completely that the Greeks forgot how to write. The great trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, one of the most cosmopolitan places in the ancient world, was burned and never rebuilt. Dozens of other cities across the Levant, Cyprus, and the Aegean were destroyed, abandoned, or dramatically reduced in size and complexity. And when the dust settled, the survivors found themselves in a world that was quieter, smaller, and in many ways darker than the one that had come before. Historians call this the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it remains, even now, one of the most debated and most mysterious events in the entire span of recorded human history. What happened on those warm Mediterranean shores? What forces were powerful enough to end not one civilization, but many, nearly simultaneously across a vast stretch of the known world? Tonight, we will sit with those questions together, slowly, without rushing toward answers that may not be final. We will walk through the world as it was before the collapse, prosperous, interconnected, astonishingly sophisticated. We will linger in the palaces and the port cities and the royal archives, and then we will follow the story as the signs of trouble begin to appear, one by one, like small cracks spreading through a structure that everyone assumed was permanent. The world of the Late Bronze Age had been building for centuries before it reached its peak. Bronze itself, that alloy of copper and tin that gave the age its name, had been the defining technology of civilization for more than 1,000 years. By 1200 before the Common Era, it was what swords and spearheads were made of. It was what plows were tipped with. It was what the fittings of palace doors were cast from, and the vessels that held wine at royal feasts, and the tools that craftsmen used to carve ivory and shape gold. Bronze was, in a very real sense, the high technology of the ancient world. Hard enough to hold an edge, durable enough to be cast into almost any form. And bronze had a problem. Making it required two metals, copper and tin. Copper was relatively available. There were significant deposits in Cyprus, in the Sinai, in various parts of the Aegean and the Levant, but tin was rare, genuinely, frustratingly rare. There were almost no tin deposits in the entire eastern Mediterranean region. The tin that ancient bronze smiths needed had to come from far away, from mines in what is now Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, from deposits in the mountains of Anatolia, possibly from sources as distant as Cornwall in the British Isles. To make bronze, you needed a supply chain that stretched across enormous distances, and that supply chain had to function continuously. If it broke down, even briefly, the production of bronze slowed, and the entire technological and military infrastructure of the age wobbled. This vulnerability, this absolute dependence on long-distance trade for a fundamental raw material, was one of the defining structural features of the Late Bronze Age. And it would become one of the keys to understanding what eventually destroyed it. But before we arrive at the destruction, we should spend some time in the world that was still intact, because it was remarkable. The Late Bronze Age Mediterranean was home to a cluster of great powers that historians sometimes call the Great Powers Club. These were the kingdoms large enough and wealthy enough and militarily powerful enough to deal with each other as equals, or at least to pretend to, in their correspondence. They were Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Babylonia, Assyria, and the Kingdom of Mitanni. Around them and between them were smaller but still significant kingdoms: Mycenaean Greece, the city-states of Cyprus, the great port cities of the Levantine coast, Ugarit, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and the Canaanite city-states of the interior. What bound these powers together was trade, diplomacy, and the constant exchange of goods, people, and ideas across the sea. Egypt in this period was at the height of its power. The new kingdom pharaohs, Thutmose, Ramesses, Amenhotep, had pushed Egyptian influence far beyond the Nile Valley, into Nubia in the south and the Levant in the north. Egyptian temples and fortresses stood in cities hundreds of miles from the capital. Egyptian scribes kept detailed records of tribute received from vassal states. Egyptian gold flowed outward as gifts and payments to allied kings, and Egyptian grain fed people across the region in times of shortage. The pharaoh was not just a king. He was, in the theology of the time, a god, or at least the representative of gods, whose power and favor maintained the order of the world itself. The Hittites were Egypt's great rival. From their capital at Hattusa, deep in the highlands of central Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, the Hittite kings ruled an empire that stretched from the Aegean coast in the west to the Euphrates in the east. They were formidable warriors, among the first peoples in the world to use iron on a significant scale, and their war chariots were among the most feared military technologies of the age. The defining moment of Hittite-Egyptian relations came at the Battle of Kadesh, fought sometime around 1274 before the Common Era on the banks of a river in what is now Syria. The two greatest empires of the age met in the largest chariot battle in history, and the result was, essentially, a draw. Ramesses the Great returned to Egypt and commissioned enormous inscriptions celebrating his victory. The Hittite king, Hattusili III, did the same, and then, showing the pragmatism that characterized the best of Bronze Age diplomacy, the two kings signed a peace treaty, often described as the earliest surviving peace treaty in human history, and began exchanging letters in the manner of old friends. Those letters are one of the most extraordinary survivals from the ancient world, carried on clay tablets written in the Akkadian language that served as the diplomatic lingua franca of the age. The correspondence between the rulers of the late Bronze Age great powers reveals a world of elaborate protocol, formal friendship, and constant negotiation. Kings addressed each other as brothers. They sent gifts, gold statues, horses, cedar timber, lapis lazuli jewelry, bolts of fine linen, and they expected gifts in return, and wrote irritated letters when the quality of the gold was not quite what had been promised. They negotiated marriages, sending their daughters across borders as diplomatic currency, sealing alliances with the bodies of royal women who would spend their lives in foreign palaces. They asked for doctors, for craftsmen, for military assistants. They complained about slights and celebrated deliveries. They were, in their correspondence, remarkably human. The most famous collection of these letters is known as the Amarna Archive, discovered by a local Egyptian woman in 1887 among the ruins of the city of Akhetaten, the short-lived capital of the pharaoh Akhenaten. More than 380 clay tablets, written in Akkadian cuneiform, preserve the diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian royal court during the 14th century before the Common Era. The letters come from Babylonian kings complaining about the quality of gold received, from Mitanni kings negotiating dowries for their daughters, from Hittite kings carefully positioning their expanding empire, from vassal rulers in the Levant begging for military aid, for grain, for anything that might help them survive the pressures of their neighbors. Reading the Amarna letters is like reading the diplomatic cables of a sophisticated modern government, except that the government in question was operating more than 3,000 years ago, and it was keeping careful records on clay tablets that happened to survive. The civilization that produced these letters was urban and literate in ways that are easy to underestimate. The palace at Ugarit on the Syrian coast was a sprawling administrative complex with dozens of rooms, archive chambers filled with clay tablets written in multiple scripts and languages, a sophisticated drainage system, and workshops for craftsmen producing luxury goods for export. Ugarit was not a capital city in the usual sense. It was a trading city, a cosmopolitan port where merchants from Mycenae and Egypt and Cyprus and the interior of Syria met, traded, argued, and drank together. Its residents used at least 5 different writing systems. Its archives contained documents in Ugaritic, Akkadian, Hurrian, Sumerian, and Egyptian hieroglyphics. It was, in the fullest sense of the word, a city of the world. The Mycenaean Greeks, meanwhile, were building their own palace civilization on the Greek mainland and the islands of the Aegean. At centers like Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes, enormous palace complexes dominated the landscape, surrounded by massive stone walls built from blocks so large that later Greeks, unable to imagine any human force moving them, attributed their construction to the mythological Cyclopes. These palaces were the administrative hearts of the Mycenaean world, centers of taxation, storage, craft production, and military organization. Their scribes used a writing system called Linear B, an early form of Greek adapted from an older Minoan script, to record inventories of grain and livestock, lists of workers and their rations, tallies of bronze weapons, and wool and flax. The Linear B tablets tell us the names of gods, the titles of officials, the quantities of commodities moving through the palace economy. They are the bureaucratic backbone of a civilization at the height of its organizational capacity. The world B civilization shared was threaded together by the sea. The Mediterranean, in the late Bronze Age, was not a barrier, but a highway. Ships moved along established routes, following the seasonal winds, connecting Cyprus and the Levant with the Aegean, connecting Egypt with Anatolia, connecting the grain fields of the Nile Delta with the palace storerooms of Mycenae. The trade that flowed along these routes was not just commercial exchange in the modern sense. It was the lifeblood of the palace economies, the mechanism by which tin arrived from Afghanistan, and copper arrived from Cyprus, and ivory arrived from Africa, and lapis lazuli arrived from the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, and glass ingots arrived from Egypt, and cedar wood arrived from Lebanon. We know this trade in extraordinary detail because of a single remarkable discovery. In 1982, a sponge diver named Mehmet Kakir was working off the rocky coast of southern Turkey, near a promontory called Uluburun, when he spotted something unusual on the seabed about 44 meters below the surface. He described what he saw as metal biscuits with ears, objects that turned out, when archaeologists investigated, to be copper ingots of the distinctive oxhide shape, cast in the form of a stretched animal hide with rounded handles at each corner. These ingots were the cargo of a Bronze Age merchant ship that had gone down sometime around 1300 before the Common Era, and their discovery triggered one of the most extraordinary excavations in the history of underwater archaeology. Over 11 seasons of work between 1984 and 1994, archaeologists from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology made more than 22,000 dives to document and recover the contents of the Uluburun wreck. What they found was staggering. The ship had been carrying 10 tons of copper ingots, 348 of them, arranged in careful rows across the ship's hold. It had been carrying over a ton of tin ingots in the same 10-to-1 ratio as the recipe for bronze. It had been carrying 175 glass ingots in shades of cobalt blue, turquoise, and lavender, the earliest intact glass ingots ever found. It had been carrying 149 Canaanite jars filled with terebinth resin, used as incense and perfume. It had been carrying ivory in the form of elephant tusks and hippopotamus teeth, ebony logs from sub-Saharan Africa, ostrich eggshells, gold and silver jewelry, Egyptian scarabs, Mycenaean pottery, a golden scarab bearing the name of the Queen Nefertiti, 4 swords of 3 different cultural types, a folding wooden writing tablet with ivory hinges, pomegranates, figs, almonds, olives. The objects on board the Uluburun ship came from 9 or 10 different cultures. The copper had been mined in Cyprus. The tin had been sourced partly from the Taurus Mountains of Anatolia, and partly, as isotope analysis would eventually reveal, from mines in Uzbekistan, in Central Asia. More than 2,000 miles away, the ebony came from Africa. The lapis lazuli, if it followed the standard routes of the time, had originated in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan. The ship itself appears to have been Canaanite, probably crewed by Syrian and Cypriot sailors, and it was likely headed for the Greek mainland when it went down. In a single ship's cargo, we can see the entire world of the late Bronze Age, the extraordinary reach of its trade, the complexity of its supply chains, the way that one civilization's daily needs drew in raw materials from halfway across the known world. The Uluburun wreck is not just an archaeological discovery. It is a portrait of a world. That world had its rhythms and its rituals. In the palace archives of Pylos and Mycenae, scribes recorded the rations distributed to workers. So many liters of grain, so much wine, so much oil. In the workshops attached to the palaces, craftsmen produced the goods that would be offered as diplomatic gifts or traded across the sea. Finely painted pottery, carved ivory boxes, bronze weapons with inlaid gold decoration, linen textiles dyed with the purple, extracted from murex shells. In the temples, priests performed the ceremonies that kept the gods satisfied and the rains coming and the order of the world intact. In the ports, merchants haggled over exchange rates for copper and tin, loading and unloading the deep-bellied ships that connected one world to another. And the kings, in their palaces, wrote letters. A Babylonian king writes to the Pharaoh of Egypt, complaining that the gold sent as a diplomatic gift was of disappointing quality. He had been told that gold was as common as dust in Egypt, and yet the statues he received were clearly plated rather than solid. He trusted that his dear brother, the Pharaoh, would rectify this oversight in future correspondence. The Pharaoh of Egypt writes to the king of the Hittites, confirming the terms of their peace treaty and inquiring after the king's health and the health of his household and his horses and his troops. The ruler of Byblos writes to the Pharaoh in increasingly desperate terms, explaining that enemy forces are approaching and that the grain in his storehouses is running low and that he has not received the military assistance that was promised, and that if something is not done very soon, he fears the worst. These letters survived because they were written on clay, and clay, fired by the destruction of the archives that held it, is almost indestructible. The wooden chests and papyrus scrolls and leather documents of the Bronze Age are gone, but the clay tablets that happened to be caught in the fires that burned their archive rooms were preserved by the very catastrophe that destroyed the civilization they recorded. We read the words of Bronze Age kings and merchants and officials because their cities burned, and they burned, eventually, almost all of them. But that is not where we are yet. We are still in the world before the burning, watching the ships cross the blue water, listening to the scratching of scribes at work in cool stone rooms, feeling the weight of those bronze ingots that traveled 2,000 miles to become the sword of a Mycenaean warrior or the hinge of a palace door. This was a world of remarkable achievement, remarkable reach, remarkable ambition, and it was about to become, in the space of a few generations, a memory. The first signs of what was coming were subtle. They are visible in retrospect, in the archaeological record, in the changing patterns of pottery distribution and palace records, and the shifting tone of diplomatic correspondence. But to the people living through them, those early signs may have felt like the normal fluctuations of a world that had always had droughts and skirmishes and minor disruptions, and had always recovered. Around 1250 before the Common Era, half a century before the full collapse, the records begin to show a pattern of stress, harvests failing in some regions, populations moving. The correspondence between great kings taking on a slightly more anxious tone, a request for grain here, a report of trouble on the borders there. Nothing yet that would suggest to any rational observer that everything was about to end. But something was changing, slowly at first, and then all at once. The Hittite Empire in the late 13th century before the Common Era was experiencing the kinds of internal pressure that large empires are always vulnerable to. Succession disputes among the royal family had produced periods of civil conflict. Subject peoples on the fringes of the empire were restless. The grain harvests in Anatolia, always dependent on adequate rainfall in a climate that was not reliably generous, were showing signs of decline. In one remarkable letter, the Hittite king writes to the pharaoh of Egypt, requesting grain shipments. The two powers who had fought each other at Kadesh were now, a generation later, asking each other for food. The king describes the situation bluntly. "There is famine in the land. My people are dying. If you value our brotherhood, send grain immediately." Egypt sent the grain. It was the kind of thing the Bronze Age great powers did for each other. Not out of generosity exactly, but out of the recognition that maintaining the stability of your allies was in your own interest. If the Hittite Empire destabilized, the consequences would ripple outward across the entire network of trade and diplomacy that kept the late Bronze Age world functioning. Every king in the system understood, on some level, that the system only worked if all of its major components kept working. What they perhaps did not fully understand was how fragile that system had become. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece show similar signs of stress in the late 13th century. At Pylos, on the southwestern coast of the Peloponnese, the Linear B archives from the final decades of the palace reveal a picture of a society mobilizing for something, though exactly what is unclear. Records of bronze being collected from sanctuaries, presumably to be recast as weapons, lists of watchmen being posted at coastal positions, instructions for rowers being assembled. Something was expected. Something was coming. The scribes of Pylos recorded these preparations on clay tablets in the days or weeks before their palace burned, around 1200 before the Common Era. The tablets were preserved by the fire that destroyed everything else. They could not have known, as they pressed those careful signs into wet clay, that they were recording the end of their world. In the Levant, the letters from Ugarit to its trading partners and political overlords in the years just before the city's destruction have a quality of mounting desperation. The king of Ugarit writes to the king of Elashia, which is almost certainly the island of Cyprus, reporting that he has received word of enemy ships 20 ships, then more, seen off the coast. He says that his own fleet has already been sent elsewhere, and his infantry and chariotry are deployed in Hittite territory. He is without resources, without soldiers, without ships. The city is in danger, and no help is available. Can the king of Wallachia do anything? The reply, if there was one, has not survived. What has survived is the archaeological layer just above the floors of the palace at Ugarit, a stratum of burned timber and collapsed stone and shattered pottery that dates to approximately 1200 before the Common Era. In the ash and debris of that layer, archaeologists found clay tablets in the kiln room of the palace, tablets that had been in the process of being fired when the palace was destroyed, preserved by the very fire that ended the city. Among them was a letter from the king of Wallachia to the king of Ugarit, warning that ships had been sighted, that the city should watch for them, that the people should go into the cities for safety. It was advice that arrived too late, or perhaps never arrived at all. Ugarit was not rebuilt. The fires that burned through the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean in this period were not a single coordinated event. They happened at different times, in different places, under circumstances that varied significantly from site to site. Some cities burned violently, with evidence of attack and destruction. Others were simply abandoned, their populations departing into an uncertain world and leaving their buildings to crumble. Some sites show evidence of multiple destruction events, as if the trauma was repeated. Others show no violence at all, just a slow withdrawal of population and complexity until what had been a thriving city became a quiet ruin. But across the whole arc of the Eastern Mediterranean, from mainland Greece in the west to the Levantine coast in the east, from Anatolia in the north to the edges of Egypt in the south, the pattern is unmistakable. Between roughly 1200 and 1150 before the Common Era, the Bronze Age world came apart. The palace societies of the late Bronze Age were not only centers of military and commercial power, they were also centers of culture, of art, of the kinds of human activity that go beyond mere survival into the territory of meaning. At Mycenae, the shaft graves of the early palace period had yielded astonishing goldwork. Death masks pressed from thin sheets of gold to fit the faces of kings, bronze swords with inlaid gold and silver decoration depicting hunting scenes, stone vessels carved with scenes of battle and ritual. At Knossos, on the island of Crete, which the Mycenaeans had conquered around 1500 before the Common Era, the palace walls had been covered with frescoes of extraordinary vitality. Dolphins leaping through blue water, young men and women performing the extraordinary athletic feat of bull leaping, processions of women in elaborate dress carrying offerings through decorated corridors. The arts of the late Bronze Age were not primitive. They were not rustic. They were the arts of civilizations at the height of their self-confidence, of cultures that had accumulated enough surplus and enough organizational capacity to support artists and craftsmen whose entire working lives were devoted to the production of beautiful things. The ivories carved at Ugarit and Megiddo, the painted pottery of the Mycenaeans, the gold work of Egypt, the elaborate bronze cauldrons decorated with figures of men and animals. All of this speaks of civilizations that understood beauty as a value worth a considerable investment of labor and material that producing it required. And the cultures of the late Bronze Age were not isolated from each other in their artistic traditions. The Uluburun wreck carried not just raw materials, but finished objects from multiple artistic traditions: an Egyptian scarab, Canaanite pottery, Mycenaean wine cups. The palace frescoes of the Aegean show Egyptian influence in their conventions of representation. The mythological texts of Ugarit share themes and figures with Mesopotamian literature and with the later traditions of the Hebrew Bible. The Amarna letters, written in a language that was not native to Egypt by scribes trained in a tradition that originated in Mesopotamia, are themselves an artifact of cultural mixture and exchange. The Bronze Age world was, in this sense, genuinely cosmopolitan, not in a romantic or idealized way. It was also a world of wars and tribute-taking and the brutal exploitation of agricultural labor by palace elites, but in the specific sense that its constituent civilizations were in constant contact with each other, constantly exchanging not just goods but ideas, artistic forms, religious concepts, technical knowledge, and people. Craftsmen moved between courts. Merchants carried not just copper and tin, but news and fashions and stories. Royal marriages brought foreign women into palace households, where they maintained their own languages and their own religious practices, and their own networks of correspondence with their families at home. The Bronze Age was not a world of isolated cultures, each developing in a sealed container. It was a world in constant conversation with itself. And then the conversation stopped. The letters stopped arriving. The ships stopped coming into harbor. The palace storerooms that had always been replenished, season after season, by the tribute and taxation and trade that kept the system running, were not replenished. The scribes who had always found employment in the administrative service of the palace had no palace to serve. The craftsmen who had produced luxury goods for export had no export market to serve. The entire web of specialization and exchange that had made the late Bronze Age world so productive and so sophisticated unraveled, and what replaced it for 2 or 3 centuries was something much simpler. It is worth pausing to feel the full weight of that simplification. Imagine a world with no writing. Not because writing has been uninvented, the technology exists in the memory of the few surviving scribes trained in the old traditions, but because the institutions that required writing no longer exist. Imagine a world where the administrative capacity to organize the construction of large buildings, or the distribution of goods across a region, or the maintenance of a professional military force has dissolved not because the knowledge is gone, but because the organizational framework that made it possible has collapsed. Imagine a world where the bronze that made weapons and tools has become extremely scarce because the supply chain that brought tin from Central Asia and copper from Cyprus has broken down and cannot be rebuilt in the absence of the political and commercial structures that maintained it. This is the world that the survivors of the Bronze Age collapse lived in. Simpler, quieter, in some ways more sustainable, because it made fewer demands on the natural systems that had been strained by the palace economies, but also harder, less productive, less connected, less able to accumulate the surpluses that make civilization possible in its more elaborate forms. It took centuries for the Eastern Mediterranean world to rebuild to a level of complexity comparable to the late Bronze Age. When it did, when the Greek city-states of the classical period and the Persian Empire and the Venetian trading network had rebuilt something like the integration and prosperity of the late Bronze Age, the new world was organized very differently from the old one. The palace economies were gone, replaced by more distributed forms of political and economic organization. The scribal systems of the Bronze Age were gone, replaced by alphabetic writing that was more accessible and more flexible. The religious traditions had shifted, the political boundaries had changed, the languages spoken in the harbors and the marketplaces were different, but the underlying human impulses to trade, to build, to write, to make beautiful things, to form alliances and conduct diplomacy and send letters across the sea, those had never disappeared. They had simply waited through the long silence of the Dark Age for the conditions that would allow them to flourish again. The Hittite capital of Hattusa stands today as a ruin in the hills of central Turkey, about 150 kilometers east of the modern city of Ankara. If you were to visit it, you would see great walls of stone, gateway sculptures of lions and sphinxes, the foundations of temples and palaces, and administrative buildings spread across a naturally defensible plateau. And if you were to dig into the soil at the floor level of those buildings, you would find in almost every structure that dates to the final period of Hittite occupation the same thing: a black layer, a thin stratum of ash and charred wood and scorched earth that tells the story of a single catastrophic fire sometime around 1200 before the Common Era. The Hittite Empire at its height had been one of the great powers of the world. At its peak, it had controlled territory stretching from the Aegean coast of Turkey to the upper Euphrates, from the Black Sea in the north to the edges of the Levant in the south. It had maintained a sophisticated palace administration, a system of vassal states and treaty relationships, a body of law, a literary tradition. The Hittite king was not merely a ruler, but a divine figure, the earthly representative of the storm god, responsible for maintaining the cosmic order that kept the seasons turning and the rains coming and the crops growing. The capital city of Hattusa had been home to tens of thousands of people at its height, its great walls enclosing temples and administrative quarters and residential neighborhoods. And then it was empty. The exact sequence of events that led to the abandonment of Hattusa is not fully clear, because the Hittite Empire produced no records of its own ending. The clay tablet archives of the capital fall silent before the final destruction. What the archaeology shows is that in the years before the end, the city appears to have been deliberately abandoned, valuables removed, storage vessels emptied, sacred objects taken away. This was not a city caught by surprise. This was a city that knew what was coming and tried to prepare. And then, whether by the hand of invaders or by the deliberate act of the departing population, the archaeological evidence is genuinely ambiguous. The buildings burned. After the fire, Hattusa remained empty for centuries. The ruins that tourists visit today were not continuously occupied by later civilizations that rebuilt over the Bronze Age layers. They were simply abandoned, the grass growing over the collapsed walls, the wind moving through the empty chambers of temples where priests had once performed the rituals that maintained the order of the world. It is one of the most haunting places in archaeology, not because of what remains, but because of the completeness of the silence. The story of Mycenaean Greece is different in its details, but similar in its essential shape. The Mycenaean civilization of the Greek mainland and the Aegean islands had developed over several centuries into a sophisticated palace culture, sharing many of the features of the other great civilizations of the late Bronze Age: centralized palace administration, scribal record-keeping, long-distance trade, monumental architecture, elaborate religious practices. The great palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and other centers were the beating hearts of their respective regions, controlling the movement of goods, organizing labor, maintaining the military forces that protected trade routes and projected power. Around 1200 before the Common Era, those palaces began to fail. The palace at Pylos burned, its Linear B archives preserved by the fire that destroyed everything else. The palace at Tiryns was damaged, apparently by an earthquake, around the same time. Mycenae itself, which gives the whole civilization its name, experienced a period of destruction and partial rebuilding before its final decline. One by one, across the Greek mainland and the Aegean islands, the palace systems that had organized Mycenaean life contracted, collapsed, or simply ceased to function. The consequences were not just political. They were cultural in the most fundamental sense. The linear B writing system, which the Mycenaean scribes had used to maintain the records on which the palace economy depended, disappeared. Not because people forgot how to read and write in some abstract sense, but because the administrative structures that had required writing, the palace systems that needed to keep track of grain and bronze and workers and tribute, no longer existed. Without the palaces, there was no need for the scribes. Without the scribes, there was no one to teach the next generation. Within a generation or two of the palace collapses, linear B was gone. Greece would not have a writing system again for several centuries. When writing returned, in the early first millennium BC, the Common Era, it would be based on a completely different script. The Phoenician alphabet adapted into what would become the Greek alphabet. The stories of the Bronze Age, including the great saga of the Trojan War that the Mycenaeans themselves had lived through or participated in, survived the Dark Age not in writing, but in oral tradition, passed from singer to singer across the centuries until Homer shaped them into the form we have inherited. The silence that fell over Greece in the aftermath of the palace collapses was not total, but it was profound. The population of the Greek mainland declined significantly. Estimates vary, but something on the order of a dramatic reduction in the number of occupied sites suggests major depopulation, whether through death, migration, or dispersal into smaller and less visible settlements. The magnificent fresco paintings that had decorated the palace walls, the intricate gold work of the shaft graves, the elaborate ritual systems of the palaces, all of this contracted or disappeared. People continued to live, but they lived differently, more simply, in smaller communities, with less specialization and less connection to the wider world. This is the beginning of what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, a period of roughly 300 to 400 years between the collapse of the Mycenaean palace civilization and the emergence of the classical Greek city-states. It was not a dark age in the sense of absolute barbarism or total cultural collapse. People made pottery, people told stories, people kept their local religious practices alive. But compared to the sophisticated, literate, internationally connected world of the late Bronze Age, it was a period of profound simplification and contraction. Egypt survived, but it was never quite the same. Of all the great powers of the late Bronze Age, Egypt was the one that came closest to weathering the catastrophe. The Nile continued to flood. The agricultural system of the Delta and the river valley, dependent on that annual flood rather than on rainfall, was more resilient than the rain-dependent agriculture of Anatolia and the Levant. The Egyptian state, with its deep roots in a theological tradition that identified the pharaoh as the maintainer of cosmic order, retained more of its institutional coherence than the palace systems of the Aegean or the Hittite imperial administration. But Egypt did not emerge unscathed. The reign of Ramses III, who came to the throne around 1200 before the Common Era, was defined by a series of military conflicts with the groups that Egyptian sources call the Sea Peoples, a collective term for what appears to have been a diverse mixture of peoples, some of them possibly refugees from the collapsing civilizations of the Aegean and the Levant, moving southward along the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean in search of new lands to settle. The most dramatic record of these encounters is preserved on the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramses at Medinet Habu, on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor. The reliefs on those walls depict two great battles, one by land and one by sea, in which the forces of Egypt confronted the sea peoples and, according to the Egyptian account, defeated them decisively. The sea battle is particularly vivid. Egyptian archers firing from the shore and from stable ships while the enemy vessels are caught in a chaotic melee, their crews falling into the water, the Egyptian forces pulling captives from the sea with grappling hooks. The accompanying texts identify some of the groups among the sea peoples by name: the Peliset, the Teker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Wayshesh, names that have generated enormous scholarly debate about their origins and identities. Ramses claimed a great victory, and in military terms, he may well have been right. Egypt repelled the Sea People's attempt to settle in the Delta. But the broader context of the battle was not one of Egyptian strength. The fact that Egypt faced these incursions at all, that groups of displaced people were moving through the Levant and along the coast in sufficient numbers to threaten the most powerful state in the region, was itself evidence that the world had changed. The Hittite Empire, which had been Egypt's great counterbalance in the north, was gone. The trading cities of the Levantine coast were burning or already burned. The network of allied states that had given Egypt its diplomatic context was fraying and breaking. In the decades after the battles depicted at Medinet Habu, the Egyptian empire contracted. Garrisons withdrew from the Levant. Tributes stopped flowing in from subject territories. The papyrus record shows an economy under increasing strain, with grain prices rising, workers going unpaid, and the kinds of social disruption that had always been present at the margins of Egyptian life becoming more visible and more serious. There is, in the reign of Ramesses III, a record of the first known labor strike in history. The workers who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings stopped work because their grain rations had not been delivered. They marched to the nearest administrative center and demanded what they were owed. Eventually, they received it, but the fact that the payment system had broken down at all was a sign of the structural difficulties the empire was beginning to face. Egypt would continue as a civilization. It would not disappear as the Hittites had disappeared. But the new kingdom, the age of the great pharaohs and the great temples, and the vast imperial reach, was ending. The centuries that followed would see a gradual diminution of Egyptian power, still recognizable as Egypt, still governed by pharaohs, still building temples and writing hieroglyphics, but smaller, less wealthy, less connected to the wider world. In the Levant, the story was more complete. The trading cities that had made the eastern Mediterranean coast one of the most commercially active stretches of shoreline in the ancient world burned one by one. In the decades around 1200 before the Common Era, Ugarit, as we have seen, was destroyed and never rebuilt. Megiddo, the great city in what is now northern Israel, whose name would give rise to the word Armageddon, was burned. Hazor, another major Canaanite city, was destroyed. Lachish, Ashkelon, and other Levantine cities show destruction layers from this period. The archaeological picture is one of systematic disruption moving down the coast, though the timing and causes vary from site to site. Not every city was destroyed violently. Some appear to have been simply abandoned, their populations departing before the destruction arrived, or drifting away as the trade networks that had made them prosperous ceased to function. A city built on commerce can survive almost anything except the end of commerce. When the ships stopped coming, when the caravans stopped arriving, when the palace administrators who had organized the distribution of goods and the collection of tribute were no longer there to keep the system running, the cities that had flourished in the web of late Bronze Age trade had no reason to exist. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Bronze Age collapse. It was not simply a series of military defeats, or natural disasters that happened to coincide. It was the failure of a system. And systems can fail in ways that no individual part of the system anticipated or intended, in ways that the people living through the failure may not have understood as system failure at all. They would have experienced it as drought, as invasion, as civil unrest, as the breakdown of supply chains, as the failure of their neighbors to honor their obligations, as the slow withdrawal of prosperity from a world that had seemed to promise its permanence. What was the system that failed? It was the entire interlocking web of the Late Bronze Age, the palace economies of the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittites and the Levantine cities, the trade networks that carried copper from Cyprus and tin from Afghanistan and grain from Egypt, the diplomatic relationships that maintained the flow of gifts and letters and princesses across the sea, the scribal systems that recorded and coordinated all of it. These were not separate things. They were aspects of a single functioning whole, and the whole was more fragile than any of its parts might have suggested. Imagine the supply chain for bronze. Tin mines in Uzbekistan produce raw tin ore. Small communities of highland pastoralists extract and refine it. Merchants carry it overland through Iran and Mesopotamia, or along the ancient roads through Anatolia. It arrives at a Hittite provincial capital, where it is taxed and stored and shipped to the imperial capital at Hattusa, or sold to Assyrian merchants who carry it westward. Eventually it reaches a port city on the Mediterranean coast, Ugarit, perhaps, or one of the Cypriot harbors, where it is loaded onto a ship alongside copper ingots from the Cypriot mines. The ship sails counterclockwise around the eastern Mediterranean, following the seasonal winds, stopping at Levantine ports and Aegean islands before arriving at its destination, where the tin and copper are unloaded, weighed by scribes using standard weights, and sent to palace workshops where bronze's smiths melt them together in the correct ratio and cast them into the ingots that will become, eventually, the weapons and tools and ritual objects of the palace culture. This supply chain worked beautifully when all its components were functioning, but it required all of its components to function. If the Hittite Empire destabilized and could no longer guarantee the safety of the Anatolian trade routes, the tin supply was disrupted. If the Mycenaean palaces collapsed and could no longer provide the administrative organization to receive and distribute imported bronze, the demand disappeared. If the Levantine trading cities burned and the merchants who connected one end of the network to the other were killed or scattered, the network ceased to exist. And if the climate dried and harvests failed and populations began moving in search of food, all of these things could happen more or less simultaneously in a cascade of failures that no part of the system had the resources or the resilience to stop. This is what modern scholars mean when they speak of a system's collapse. Not a single cause, not a single disaster, but the failure of a complex, tightly interconnected system in which the failure of one component amplified the stress on all the others, until the whole structure, which had seemed so permanent, came apart. The historian Eric Klein, whose book on the Bronze Age collapse draws on decades of archaeological and textual research, has described it as a perfect storm, a convergence of multiple stressors, no one of which would have been sufficient to bring down the late Bronze Age world, but which together, arriving simultaneously, overwhelmed the system's capacity to adapt and recover. Climate change, bringing drought to the rain-dependent agriculture of Anatolia and the Levant. Earthquakes, disrupting cities that were already under stress. Population movements, as people displaced by drought and political instability pushed into regions that could not absorb them. Internal revolts, as the lower classes of palace societies The workers and farmers who bore the greatest burden of taxation and who were first to suffer when harvests failed turned against the elite structures that had stopped protecting them. Disruption of trade, as all of these stressors combined to make the movement of goods across the Mediterranean more dangerous, more expensive, and eventually impossible. That is one part of the answer. The framework, the architecture of collapse. But a framework is not the full picture. The full picture, the part that may genuinely surprise you, the part we promised at the very beginning of tonight, is still ahead, waiting in the quieter and stranger truth of what the ruins tell us when you look at them, not as a catastrophe, but as a kind of message. Stay with us. And over all of this, the mysterious presence of the Sea Peoples. Who were the Sea Peoples? This is one of the great unanswered questions of ancient history. And the answer, to the extent that there is an answer, is probably more complicated than any simple explanation allows. The term Sea Peoples was not used by the ancient peoples themselves. It was coined in the 19th century by a French Egyptologist named Emmanuel de Rouget, who used it to describe the groups depicted in the reliefs and texts from the reign of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu. The Egyptian sources give these groups names: the Peliset, the Teker, the Shekelesh, the Denian, the Washesh, and others, and describe them as coming from the islands and from the sea, as moving in large numbers by both land and water, as attacking the cities of the Levant and Cyprus, and eventually Egypt itself. The visual representations at Medinet Habu show warriors with distinctive feathered headdresses, fighting from ox-drawn carts loaded with women and children and household goods, an image not of raiders but of a people in migration, carrying everything they owned. For much of the 20th century, the Sea Peoples were treated as the primary cause of the Bronze Age collapse, a great migration of warlike peoples from somewhere in the Aegean or the wider Mediterranean world, who swept through the Levant and Anatolia and Cyprus like a wave of destruction, burning cities and toppling empires as they went. This interpretation appealed in part because it offered a simple, dramatic explanation for a complex and confusing series of events. It had the satisfying shape of a narrative. There was an identifiable villain, a wave of destruction, and a clear sequence of cause and effect. Modern scholarship is considerably more skeptical. The evidence does not support the idea of a single organized migration or invasion of sea peoples sweeping through the eastern Mediterranean from some identifiable homeland. The different groups named in Egyptian sources appear to have had different origins. Some may have been Mycenaean Greeks displaced by the collapse of the palace civilization. Some may have been Anatolians, people from the western and southern coasts of what is now Turkey, disrupted by the collapse of Hittite imperial authority. Some may have been people from Cyprus or the Levant itself, displaced by earlier phases of the disruption. The Egyptian texts describe them as coming from the islands, but islands of which sea is not always clear. The most likely interpretation, based on the current state of the evidence, is that the Sea Peoples were not a single people or a single movement, but rather a diverse and shifting coalition of displaced populations, refugees from the earlier phases of the Bronze Age collapse, who, finding their own homelands disrupted or destroyed, moved southward along the Levantine coast in search of new places to settle, raiding and fighting as they went, sometimes being repelled and sometimes being absorbed into the regions they entered. The Peliset, one of the groups named by the Egyptians, are believed by many scholars to be the people who settled on the southern coast of Canaan and became known, in later traditions, as the Philistines. In this reading, the Sea Peoples are not so much the cause of the Bronze Age collapse as one of its consequences. Populations set in motion, by the collapse of the systems that had supported them, becoming themselves a source of disruption as they moved. But the honest answer to the question of who the Sea Peoples were is that we do not fully know. We have their names, as the Egyptians recorded them. We have images of their warriors and their wagons. We have texts describing their movements and the battles fought against them. And we have centuries of scholarly debate about their origins that has not yet produced a consensus. They remain, in the archaeology of the Bronze Age collapse, one of the most compelling and least fully answered questions. The climate record adds another layer to the story that has only become fully visible in recent decades. As paleoclimatological research has allowed scientists to reconstruct the weather patterns of 3,000 years ago with increasing precision, pollen studies from lake beds, isotope analysis of cave formations, analysis of ancient tree rings, examination of sediment cores from the seafloor, these techniques have allowed researchers to build a picture of Mediterranean climate change in the late Bronze Age that is striking in its implications. The evidence suggests that around 1200 before the Common Era, a prolonged drought descended on the eastern Mediterranean region. Not a brief, single-season drought of the kind that agricultural societies had always experienced and learned to buffer against, but a multi-decade dry period that reduced rainfall significantly across a wide area, including Anatolia, the Levant, and parts of the Aegean, for something on the order of 2 to 3 centuries. This was the kind of climate shift that could not be absorbed by palace storehouses full of grain, because the storehouses were themselves dependent on the agricultural surpluses that the drought was eliminating. Crop failures were not occasional bad years to be endured. They were a persistent, grinding reduction in the productive capacity of the land, compounding year after year, straining the social and political systems that had been built on the assumption of adequate food supply. The connection between drought and social instability is well documented across human history. When people are hungry, they move. When people move in large numbers, they displace other people, who move in turn. When the social contract, the implicit agreement by which people accept the authority of rulers and the obligations of taxation in exchange for the protection and provision that the rulers are supposed to supply, breaks down because the rulers can no longer provide the promised security and sustenance, the result is internal revolt, migration, and the breakdown of the political structures that had maintained order. In the late Bronze Age, all of these processes appear to have been operating simultaneously across a wide area in a system that was already tightly integrated enough that a disruption in one place rippled to the entire network. The drought in Anatolia stressed the Hittite agricultural base, disrupting the grain supply that supported the palace administration, which in turn disrupted the Hittite capacity to maintain control of the trade routes through their territory, which disrupted the flow of tin to the Mediterranean, which disrupted bronze production everywhere that depended on Anatolian trade routes for tin. Meanwhile, the drought in the Levant stressed the populations of the Canaanite city-states and the farming communities of the interior, producing the population movements that contributed to the disruption of the coastal trading cities. Meanwhile, the disruption of the Mycenaean palace systems, whether from climate, earthquake, internal revolt, or the loss of the trade networks that had made the palace economy viable, removed one of the key nodes of the Eastern Mediterranean trade network. Each failure made the others worse. The system that had sustained the Bronze Age world had no safety valve that was adequate to a failure of this scale. The earthquake hypothesis deserves a mention here, because the geological record does provide evidence that the Eastern Mediterranean region experienced a significant increase in seismic activity in the period around 1200 before the Common Era. Amos Nur, a geophysicist who devoted considerable attention to the question, identified what he called an earthquake storm, a sequence of major seismic events that appear to have occurred across the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean over a period of several decades. Mycenae shows evidence of earthquake damage. Tiryns shows earthquake damage. Ugarit, Megiddo, and other Levantine sites have been associated by some researchers with seismic events. The palace at Knossos on Crete had been damaged by earthquake a century earlier. Whether earthquakes were a primary cause of the collapse or merely one stress among many is debated. Earthquakes alone, even severe ones, do not typically destroy civilizations. People rebuild, as they always have. But in a system already under multiple stressors, the additional burden of major seismic damage to palace infrastructure could have been enough to tip specific nodes of the network from stressed functionality into collapse, contributing to the cascade. There is also the possibility of internal revolt. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age were, to put it plainly, extractive. The palace took a significant portion of agricultural production as tax and tribute, redistributing some of it back to workers and craftsmen in the form of rations and employment, but retaining the surplus that funded the elite's consumption, the diplomatic gift exchanges, the maintenance of military forces, and the architectural projects that expressed and reinforced the power of the ruling class. This system worked tolerably well when harvests were adequate and the redistribution was sufficient to maintain the loyalty and basic welfare of the non-elite population. When harvests declined and the redistribution became inadequate, the social contract frayed. In the Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III, there are clear signs of this fraying. The labor strike at Deir el-Medina, the records of grain being stolen from palace storehouses, the evidence of tomb robbing, which became rampant in this period, and which the papyrus records note was often motivated by the need for food rather than simple acquisitiveness. The scholars who had devoted their lives to maintaining the records of the palace economy were apparently not being paid adequately. The workers who built the monuments of Egyptian civilization were hungry. The system of redistribution that had always justified the palace's extraction was failing. If this was happening in Egypt, which was more resilient than most, it was almost certainly happening more severely in the other palace economies of the age. The Mycenaean tablets from Pylos show a palace mobilizing bronze from temples and posting watchmen on the coast, a society that appears to know it is under threat. Whether the threat that materialized was external attack, internal revolt, or both, the palace did not survive it. When the palace systems of the late Bronze Age collapsed, they took with them something that is easy to underestimate: the entire organizational and informational infrastructure of the civilizations they had supported. The palace was not just a building, it was the administrative brain of its society, the center through which grain flowed in and rations flowed out, through which bronze was collected and weapons were distributed, through which diplomatic correspondence was composed and received, through which the legal and economic and religious systems of the society were maintained. When the palace ceased to function, all of these systems ceased to function with it. There was no alternative infrastructure to absorb their functions. There was no second system waiting to take over. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse different from the fall of, say, the Western Roman Empire. A comparison that is sometimes made, but is in important ways misleading. When Rome fell in the West, the Church remained. Local aristocracies remained. The Latin language and its written traditions remained, at least partially, in the hands of literate clergy. There were institutional and cultural continuities that bridged the transition from Roman governance to medieval governance. However painful that transition was, the late Bronze Age had no such bridging institutions. When the palace went, everything the palace had maintained went with it. Writing disappeared. Long-distance trade collapsed. Specialist craftsmen who had depended on the palace for their raw materials and their markets had nowhere to practice their trades. The very complexity that had made the late Bronze Age world so remarkable became the source of its brittleness, because complex systems, when they fail completely. The bronze supply is the starkest example. Bronze production in the late Bronze Age was not a local enterprise. It was a supply chain operation of extraordinary reach, dependent on the continuous functioning of trade networks that connected mines in Uzbekistan with smithies in Greece. When the trade networks broke down, when the Levantine ports that had been the nodes of the Mediterranean trading system burned or emptied, when the palace administrators who had organized the receipt and distribution of raw materials were no longer there, when the ships that had crossed the sea loaded with copper and tin ingots stopped sailing, the supply of bronze simply stopped. And without bronze, the entire technological infrastructure of the age, the weapons, the tools, the agricultural implements, the ritual objects, could not be maintained or replaced. This is why the Bronze Age ended and the Iron Age began. Not because someone invented iron. Iron had been known and used for centuries. But because iron, unlike bronze, can be produced from local materials in almost any part of the world. You do not need a supply chain reaching from Cyprus to Uzbekistan to make iron. You need iron ore, which is widely distributed, and charcoal, which can be made from wood. Iron technology, specifically the carburization process that produces hardened iron capable of taking an edge, had been developing in various parts of Anatolia and the Levant during the Bronze Age. It was a known technology, but it had been, in a sense, economically unnecessary in a world where the bronze supply chain was functioning well. When the bronze supply chain collapsed, iron stopped being unnecessary. It became essential. Over the following centuries, iron technology spread rapidly around the Mediterranean world and beyond, carried by smiths and traders into communities that were rebuilding from the wreckage of the Bronze Age. The weapons and tools of the New Age would be made of iron. And this shift, from an age defined by a rare alloy dependent on long-distance trade to an age defined by a metal that could be produced almost anywhere, was itself a kind of democratization of technology. The Iron Age was, in some ways, more accessible than the Bronze Age had been, because its raw material was not concentrated in a few distant sources, but distributed across the landscape. You did not need an empire to have iron. You needed a smithy and a forge. The world that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was, in almost every measurable respect, simpler. Population had declined significantly across the eastern Mediterranean. Settlements were smaller and more rural. Monumental architecture, the massive palace complexes, the great walls, the elaborate temple systems largely ceased. Long-distance trade, which had been the connective tissue of the Bronze Age world, contracted dramatically. The sophisticated scribal and administrative systems that had maintained the palace economies vanished. Art became less elaborate. Pottery became simpler. The material culture of the early Iron Age, compared to the material culture of the late Bronze Age, looks impoverished, but it was not a total darkness. People continued to live. Communities continued to organize themselves. Oral traditions preserve the memories and stories of the Bronze Age, passed down through generations in the absence of writing, until the development of alphabetic scripts in the early first millennium before the Common Era gave those memories a new medium. The Iliad and the Odyssey, whenever they were first composed in anything like the forms we have inherited, were drawing on oral traditions that preserved the memory of the Mycenaean palace civilization and the world it inhabited, the bronze-armed warriors, the great ships, the rich palaces, the competitive, honor-driven culture of the late Bronze Age Aegean. On the coast of the Levant, a remarkable continuity emerged from the wreckage. The Phoenicians, the people of the coastal cities of what is now Lebanon and northern Israel, had been part of the Bronze Age trading world as Canaanites and Ugaritans and the inhabitants of Byblos and Tyre and Sidon. When the Bronze Age trading network collapsed, they did not disappear. Instead, they adapted. Without the palace-based organizational system that had structured Bronze Age trade, they developed something different, a merchant culture organized around family and kinship networks rather than palace administration. Flexible and resilient in ways that the palace economies had not been, capable of operating at smaller scale and adapting to the reduced trading conditions of the early Iron Age. The Phoenicians would, over the following centuries, become the great maritime traders and colonizers of the ancient world. They established trading posts and eventually colonies across the entire Mediterranean, in North Africa, in Spain, in Sardinia, and Sicily. Across the sea lanes that had once been dominated by Mycenaean and Cypriot ships, they carried with them the most lasting technological legacy of the Levantine world, the alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet, a consonantal writing system of 22 characters derived from an earlier Proto-Sinaitic script, was the ancestor of the Greek alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, the Aramaic script, and ultimately of the Latin alphabet and all the writing systems that descend from it. The Phoenicians did not invent writing, but they took a simplified, flexible form of written notation and spread it across the world, making literacy accessible in ways that the complex cuneiform and hieroglyphic systems of the Bronze Age had never been. The Greek city-states that emerged from the dark age of the late 2nd and early 1st millennium BC, the Common Era, were deeply different from the Mycenaean palace civilization that had preceded them. They were organized not around centralized palace administrations, but around the community of citizens, a concept that had no real equivalent in the palace economies of the Bronze Age. The political philosophy that would eventually produce democracy, the literary tradition that would produce Homer and Hesiod, and the tragic poets, the philosophical inquiry that would produce Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. All of this grew from a world that had been, in a sense, rebuilt from scratch after the collapse. The catastrophe that ended the Bronze Age was, paradoxically, one of the conditions that made the classical world possible. We do not know what the people who lived through the collapse experienced, how they understood what was happening to them, what stories they told each other to make sense of the world falling apart around them. We can only infer their experience from the archaeological record, from the material remains of their daily lives, from the burned layers of their cities and the hurried final tablets of their scribes. We know that the scribe at Pylos was still pressing signs into clay in the days before the palace burned. We know that the merchants of Ugarit were still conducting business, still sending and receiving letters, still loading ships with copper and grain in the final weeks before the city was destroyed. We know that someone in the burning palace of Hattusa made decisions about what to take and what to leave behind. They were living through something they could not have fully understood. The collapse of a world is not visible as such from inside it. You do not know, when you are the scribe at Pylos recording ration distributions for the following month, that there will be no following month, that the institution you serve and the civilization that institution supports is about to end, that the writing system you use will disappear within a generation and not return for centuries. You know that things are difficult. You know that there are threats. You know that the harvest was poor, and that strangers have been seen on the coast, and that the bronze supply from the usual sources has been irregular. But you go to work. You press your signs into the clay, you record the rations and the inventories and the lists of watchmen at their posts, and then the fire comes. What we still do not know, despite more than a century of intensive scholarly attention to the Bronze Age collapse, is significant. We do not know the precise sequence of events, which came first, which caused which, how the different stressors interacted in their specific historical order. We do not know exactly who the Sea Peoples were, or where they originated, or whether they were primarily cause or consequence of the disruptions they moved through. We do not know how much of the collapse was driven by climate and how much by human agency, by the decisions of kings and the movements of populations and the failures of administrative systems. We do not know, in many specific cases, who destroyed specific cities. The burned layer at Ugarit was left by someone. The fire at Hattusa was set by someone, or by a decision made by someone. The palace at Pylos was burned by someone, or in some event. In some cases, the evidence points toward external attack, in others toward internal revolt, in others toward deliberate abandonment. Often the evidence is simply insufficient to determine the cause. Archaeology can tell you that a city burned at a particular time. It cannot always tell you who burned it or why. And the mystery of the simultaneity, the fact that so many civilizations across such a wide area failed within such a relatively short span of time, has never been fully resolved. Systems collapse theory offers the most intellectually satisfying framework. When a tightly interconnected system fails, it fails everywhere at once, because the failure of each component accelerates the failure of the others. But systems collapse theory is itself a model, an interpretation, a way of organizing the evidence into a coherent narrative. It does not eliminate uncertainty. It provides a framework for understanding uncertainty. The Bronze Age collapse is, in the end, a story about fragility, about the way that complexity, which is the source of civilization's greatest achievements, is also the source of its greatest vulnerability. The late Bronze Age world was extraordinary precisely because it was so tightly integrated, so dependent on the continuous functioning of supply chains that stretched from Uzbekistan to Greece, so organized around palace systems that required constant inputs of raw materials and labor and political stability to keep operating. And it was fragile for exactly the same reasons. Remove enough of those inputs, disrupt enough of those supply chains, stress enough of those palace systems simultaneously, and the whole thing fails. This is not a lesson that belongs only to the Bronze Age. This is not meant to alarm us. It is simply a gentle reminder that complex worlds, in any age, depend on many quiet threads, most of them invisible until they are gone. The Bronze Age people who loaded those copper ingots onto ships in Cyprus did not know that they were participating in a system that would one day fall silent. They were doing what made sense, what was familiar, what had always worked. They could not see the brittleness of the structure from inside it. We look back at them across more than 3,000 years, and we can see the brittleness they could not see. We can trace in the archaeological record and the clay tablet archives and the burn destruction layers the shape of a collapse that took 50 years to complete and several centuries to recover from. We can name the stressors and describe the cascades and gesture toward explanations, even if we cannot reach final certainty. And there is something in this looking back, this slow examination of a world that ended, that carries its own kind of meaning. The people of the late Bronze Age were not so different from us. They worried about harvests and supply chains and the intentions of their neighbors. They wrote letters to allies asking for grain and gold. They posted watchmen on their coastlines when they heard that ships had been seen. They kept careful records of everything they owned and everything that moved through their economies, pressing signs into clay in the hours before the fire. They built something remarkable. They built it across the deep challenge of maintaining a complex, interconnected civilization across hundreds of miles of open sea and mountain passes and desert routes. They sustained it for centuries, longer than many of the civilizations that came after them. And when it ended in the way that very large, very complex things often end. Not in a single moment of catastrophic decision, but in a slow accumulation of pressures that the system had no way to absorb, followed by a cascade that was too fast to stop. The cities they built are ruins now. Some of them are beneath the foundations of modern cities. Beirut, Damascus, parts of Istanbul. Their burned layers sealed beneath millennia of continuous habitation. Others are in open fields or on hills above valleys where farmers still work the same land that Bronze Age farmers worked, producing the same wheat and olives and grapes that went into the jars on the ships that once crossed this sea. The sea itself is unchanged. The same blue, the same seasonal winds, the same coastlines. We dig into those ruins carefully, a centimeter at a time, because we know that what is there matters, not just as information about the past, but as something more like a kind of listening. The burned layers and the abandoned palaces and the final clay tablets are the last transmissions of a world that no longer exists. When we excavate them, we are not just collecting data, we are receiving a message from people who lived and worked and worried and died, and could not have imagined that anyone 3,000 years later would be paying such careful attention to the traces they left behind. The Bronze Age knew itself to be civilized. Its kings wrote letters in the shared language of the age. Its traders maintained accounts and honored contracts. Its scribes recorded the lives of their communities in writing systems that would disappear with the collapse and be forgotten for centuries. Its people built palaces that they expected to stand forever, maintained trade networks that they assumed would always function, relied on supply chains that they trusted to deliver what was needed when it was needed. And in a world that is now only visible through its ruins, in the ash layers and the clay tablets and the burned timber of palaces that have not had roofs for 3,000 years, the memory of what they built persists. Quietly, without drama. The way that very old things persist, not by insisting on their significance, but simply by continuing to exist, waiting for the patience and the curiosity and the care that archaeology brings to its slow work of recovery. Tonight, as you rest, the ruins of the late Bronze Age are sitting in the darkness where they have always been. In the hills of Anatolia, at the place called Bogazkoy, the great walls of Hattusa stand open to the sky, the gate lions still watching the entrance to a city that has been empty for 3,000 years. On the coast of Syria, in the fields above the village of Ras Shamra, the outlines of the Palace of Ugarit are still visible in the earth. The archive rooms where the final desperate letters were found, still marked by their burned floor. In the Peloponnese, the ruins of the Palace of Pylos sit on their hill above the bay, the threshold stone of the main entrance, still in place, worn by the feet of Bronze Age people who are long beyond all counting. They are very quiet places now, the kind of quiet that comes not from absence of life, but from the presence of so much time. The air above them carries the same light it always has, the same warmth in summer, the same winter rains. The soil that covers their burned floors has been accumulating slowly, a millimeter at a time, for 3,000 years. And somewhere in that soil, in the careful archive rooms of the Palace of Ugarit, in the administrative quarters of Hattusa, and the burned storerooms of Pylos, the clay tablets are still there. The last words of the Bronze Age, pressed into clay by scribes who did not know they were writing the last words of a world preserved by the fires that destroyed everything else. Waiting. For now, there is nothing left to do but rest. Whatever questions remain unanswered about the collapse of the late Bronze Age, and many remain, they will wait until morning. The sea is the same sea it has always been. The stars above the ruins of Ugarit are the same stars the merchants and scribes and kings of the Bronze Age watched from their walls. Time has moved through those ruins as water moves through stone, slowly, patiently, without malice, changing everything and preserving, in its deepest layers, more than we will ever fully recover. Let your breath slow. Let the weight of the day settle away from you, as gently as silt settling in still water. The world has been here a very long time, through collapses and recoveries and the long silences between one age and the next. Tonight, you are resting in the middle of that long story, somewhere between the Bronze Age and whatever comes after us, in a world that is itself, like all worlds, more fragile and more remarkable than it usually appears. Sleep well, and thank you for spending this time with us. If this video is bringing you some quiet tonight, a like and a gentle word in the comments means more than you know. Now, if you are still with us, we will continue slowly. There is more of this world worth remembering. But before we reach that quiet ending, let us linger a little longer in the world that was lost. Because what the Bronze Age built deserves more than a brief accounting. It deserves to be remembered in some of the specific, human detail that the archaeologists and the text scholars have recovered from its ruins. Consider Ugarit in the decades before its destruction. It was not a large city by modern standards. Perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 people lived within its walls and in the settlements around it, but it was one of the most cosmopolitan places on Earth. Its harbor received ships from Cyprus, from Egypt, from the Aegean, from the cities of the Levantine coast, and the interior of Syria. Its merchants maintained accounts in multiple currencies and conducted business in multiple languages. Its scribes were trained in Ugaritic, which was written in a consonantal alphabet, one of the earliest alphabetic scripts, as well as in Akkadian cuneiform for international correspondence. The royal palace, which had been rebuilt and expanded over several generations, was a complex of more than 90 rooms surrounding internal courtyards, with an elaborate drainage system of stone-lined channels that carried wastewater out through the walls. In the archive rooms of that palace, archaeologists have found clay tablets that together represent one of the richest textual archives of the ancient world. Administrative records, legal documents, international correspondence, literary texts including a cycle of mythological poems about the god Baal that influenced later Canaanite and eventually Israelite religious traditions, dictionaries, scribal exercises. The tablets are written in at least 6 different languages and 5 different scripts. They represent the intellectual and commercial life of a city that was at the intersection of multiple great civilizations, absorbing influences from all of them and producing something that was distinctively its own. The merchants of Ugarit were not simple traders. They were sophisticated businessmen operating within a complex legal and financial framework. Clay tablets record loans at specified rates of interest, property transactions, contracts for the delivery of goods at future dates, disputes about unpaid debts, letters of credit. The entire apparatus of a commercial society pressed into clay and fired in archive rooms that would eventually be sealed by the ash of the city's destruction. We know the names of some of these merchants. We know their business relationships. We know, from their letters, something of their anxieties and their ambitions. One merchant writes from a distant city, complaining that the goods he ordered have not arrived. Another writes from Ugarit itself, instructing an agent in Cyprus about a shipment of copper. A third, and this is one of the most poignant survivals from the Bronze Age archive, writes to his mother. He has been away from home for a long time. He misses her. He asks about the health of the household. He tells her he will return when he can. He does not know, as he presses those signs into the clay, that the city he is writing from will be destroyed within years or decades. He does not know that his letter, which he expected to be read and set aside and eventually forgotten, will survive for 3,000 years in the sealed ash of the palace archive. His letter survives. His name survives. His words survive. Everything else about him is gone. This is the particular melancholy of the Bronze Age record. It shows us enough to care about the people and not quite enough to know them fully. We have their administrative records and their diplomatic correspondence and their commercial contracts. We have, occasionally, their personal letters. We have the images on their pottery and their palace walls, processions of offering bearers, warriors in chariots, bulls being led to sacrifice, ships under sail, women playing musical instruments in palace gardens. We have the grave goods from their burials, gold masks and bronze weapons, and ivory combs and stone vessels filled with perfumed oil that dried 3,000 years ago and left only a residue. We have enough to know that the Bronze Age world was not an abstraction. It was a world of real people with real concerns and real pleasures and real fears, living in real cities that they had built with considerable skill and effort and expected to last. And we have the burned layer that tells us they were wrong about the lasting. The Mycenaean palace at Pylos on the southwestern coast of the Peloponnese was excavated beginning in 1939 by the American archaeologist Carl Blegen. He found a palace of remarkable sophistication, frescoed walls, a throne room, bathing chambers, a central hearth surrounded by painted columns, storerooms full of thousands of clay pots for wine and oil and grain. And he found the tablets, more than 1,000 Linear B tablets preserved by the fire that had destroyed the palace around 1200 before the Common Era. Many of them were accounting records, inventories of bronze, lists of rowers, tallies of livestock, records of land tenure in the surrounding territory. They tell us the names of gods who were worshipped at Pylos, some recognizable from later Greek religion, some not. They tell us the names of officials and their titles. They tell us how many jars of oil were stored in which room, how many sheep were in which pasture, how many men owed which obligations to the palace. What they do not tell us, what no Bronze Age text has yet told us, with the possible exception of the Ugarit distress letters, is what it felt like when everything ended. The scribes of Pylos left no account of the days before the fire. There are no records of decisions made in the face of the approaching catastrophe. There are no final letters, no testaments, no laments. The clay tablets go on until they stop, and then there is silence, and then there is ash. The silence is its own kind of testimony. In the absence of final words, the fire speaks for itself. And in the centuries that followed the collapse, the world that emerged had to make sense of what had happened without the benefit of the records that the fire had destroyed. The people who survived, reduced in number, scattered across a landscape of abandoned cities and overgrown fields, living in smaller communities, with less access to the technologies and organizational systems of the Bronze Age, carried with them the oral memories of what had been. Stories of great kings and their battles. Stories of cities that had been the richest in the world. Stories of heroes who had sailed across the sea. Some of those stories found their way, eventually, into the Homeric poems. The Iliad's great bronze-armed warriors, the richly appointed palaces, the ships drawn up on the beaches, the gods intervening in human affairs from their vantage point on Mount Olympus. All of this has, at some level, a Bronze Age substrate. The specific details may have been transformed, mythologized, reshaped by centuries of oral transmission, and the particular genius of the poet or poets who gave the poems their final form. But the world behind the poems, the world of palace civilizations and long-distance trade and brilliant bronze weapons and diplomatic marriages and the competitive, honor-driven culture of aristocratic warriors, is recognizably the world of the Late Bronze Age. In this sense, the Bronze Age did not entirely end with the collapse. It survived in the form of story, carried through the Dark Age in the memory of singers, passed from generation to generation until it could be written down again in the new alphabet that the Phoenicians had spread around the Mediterranean. The tales of the heroes were a kind of cultural inheritance, connecting the classical world to the Bronze Age past, even after the administrative and economic and political structures of that past were gone beyond recovery. There is something quietly remarkable about this. A world that burned was preserved in song. The palace at Pylos collapsed and was not rebuilt, its walls eaten by the weather over 3,000 years. But the stories of the people who had lived in palaces like it survived, transformed and reshaped, but recognizably continuous with what had been. Human memory is more durable than stone, it turns out, even when the stone burns. The modern scholarly understanding of the Bronze Age collapse has itself been built up slowly over more than a century of excavation and analysis and debate. The great sites of the Late Bronze Age, Hattusa, Ugarit, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Megiddo, Hazor, have been excavated by successive generations of archaeologists who have painstakingly documented the destruction layers and the artifact assemblages and the architectural remains, building a picture that grows richer and more nuanced with every new season of fieldwork. The Linear B tablets were deciphered only in 1952 by Michael Ventris, a British architect who had been working on the problem as a hobby since childhood. His decipherment, which revealed that Linear B was an early form of Greek, connecting the Mycenaean civilization directly to the later classical Greek world, was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century, and it transformed our understanding of the Bronze Age overnight. Suddenly, the palace archives of Pylos and Mycenae were legible. Suddenly, the names of Mycenaean gods and officials and places could be read. Suddenly, the depth and sophistication of the Mycenaean administrative system was visible in a way that no amount of pottery analysis or architectural study could have revealed. The Ugarit archives were excavated in the 1930s and have been studied ever since, their multiple scripts and languages yielding a picture of cultural complexity that continues to surprise. The Amarna letters, found in 1887, were first fully translated into English in 1992 by William Moran, opening the diplomatic correspondence of the Bronze Age great powers to a scholarly audience that had previously had to rely on summaries and partial translations. The Uluburun wreck, discovered in 1982 and excavated over 11 seasons, gave us the cargo manifest of the Bronze Age trading network in material form, three-dimensional and tangible, recoverable from the sea floor after 3,000 years. Each new discovery adds to the picture. In recent decades, Isotope analysis has allowed researchers to trace the origins of metal ingots with remarkable precision, telling us where the tin on the Uluburun ship was mined. Palynological studies, pollen analysis from lake and swamp deposits have allowed climate scientists to reconstruct the rainfall patterns of the late second millennium before the Common Era, with increasing resolution, providing the paleoclimatological framework for understanding the drought hypothesis. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have allowed archaeologists to map the layouts of sites that have not been fully excavated, revealing the extent of Bronze Age cities and their hinterlands. We are learning more constantly. The picture is more complete than it was a generation ago, and it will be more complete still a generation from now. New sites are being excavated, new texts are being discovered and analyzed. New scientific techniques are being applied to old materials and producing new answers. But the fundamental mystery, the question of why so many civilizations across such a wide area collapsed within such a relatively short span of time, retains its depth. Systems collapse theory, the drought hypothesis, the earthquake sequence, the sea peoples, internal revolt, all of these are genuine contributing factors, supported by genuine evidence. None of them alone is sufficient. All of them together point toward a catastrophe of remarkable scope and complexity. The most honest thing that can be said about the Bronze Age collapse is this: it happened, and it was one of the most significant events in the history of human civilization. And we still do not fully understand it. We may never fully understand it, because the evidence that would resolve the remaining uncertainties is either lost forever or buried under millennia of subsequent occupation and geological change. And in that uncertainty, there is something quietly appropriate. The Bronze Age collapse is, at its deepest level, a reminder of how much of the past is simply beyond our reach. We can recover fragments. We can read the final letters of Ugarit's king and the ration records of Pylos' scribes and the diplomatic complaints of Babylonian monarchs and the military boasts of Egyptian pharaohs. We can hold a copper ingot in our hands that was cast in Cyprus 3,000 years ago and trace, through isotope analysis, the precise geological formation from which the ore was extracted. We can stand in the gateway of Hattusa and look out across the landscape that the Hittite kings once surveyed, but we cannot fully recover the experience of living through the collapse. We cannot know what it felt like to be a merchant in Ugarit in the final days, watching the ships stop coming, hearing the reports of destruction moving down the coast, writing desperate letters that may not have reached their recipients. We cannot know what it felt like to be a scribe at Pylos, pressing clay tablets in what turned out to be the last weeks of a 300-year-old palace civilization. We cannot know what passed through the minds of the people who left Hattusa before the fire, carrying away what they could, leaving behind the city that their ancestors had built. We can only look at what they left behind: the ash layers, and the clay tablets, and the broken pottery, and the copper ingots resting on the sea floor. The gate lions of Hattusa, still watching the empty city, the linear B signs pressed by someone who could not know that their writing system would disappear within a generation. The final letter from the king of Alashia to the king of Ugarit, warning of ships that had already arrived. These things persist quietly in the soil and the sea, in the archive rooms of palaces that have been ruins for 3,000 years. They are still there, waiting, telling us, in the patient language of material remains and preserved words, about a world that once was and is not anymore, about the fragility that is always, in the end, part of the price of complexity, about the way that civilizations build and flourish, and then, sometimes suddenly, sometimes slowly, fall silent. about the way that the people who build great things rarely know they are building something temporary, because the act of building always feels like an act of permanence. The Bronze Age people built palaces they expected to stand forever. They maintained trade networks they assumed would always function. They wrote letters in the confidence that their civilization would endure long enough for the letters to matter. They were wrong about the permanence. But they were not wrong about the letters. The letters endure. The words endure. The marks pressed into clay in the last days of a world that was ending endure. And tonight, listening to the story of that world, you have received those marks across 3,000 years, not in cuneiform on clay, but in the older technology of voice and ear. The same technology that carried the Bronze Age through its own Dark Age. We promised you, at the very beginning of tonight, that the answer might be more complex and quietly surprising than you expected. Perhaps now you feel why. The answer was not a single enemy, not one disaster, not a villain you could name and point to. The answer was fragility wearing the mask of strength. A world so interconnected, so finely tuned, so dependent on every thread remaining intact, that when enough threads broke at once, the whole came undone. Not with a single blow, but with the quiet, unstoppable logic of a system that had no way left to hold itself together. That is the strange truth the ruins have been keeping. Not a mystery of who, a mystery of how something so vast, so brilliant, so alive can slowly fall quiet. Lie down now. Let your breath settle into its own slow rhythm. The ruins of the Bronze Age are quiet tonight, as they have been quiet every night for 3,000 years. The sea is the same sea it has always been. The stars above the empty gate of Hattusa are the same stars that the last Hittite gatekeepers watched before they turned and walked away from everything they had known. Whatever day this has been, it is ending now. And in the ending, there is the same quiet that has always been on the other side of a world's long work. Sleep well.